A man sits quietly on the plane. Nobody notices him. He looks normal, regular clothes, working on his laptop. No one knows his hands once flew fighter jets in war. When both engines stop at 35,000 feet, the plane starts falling. He must choose, stay quiet and let people die, or show everyone who he really is. Then military jets arrive for rescue. They speak his old fighter pilot name on the radio. Everyone hears it. His secret is out. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The coffee was mediocre, the way coffee always is at 35,000 feet. Marcus Webb accepted the small plastic cup from the flight attendant with a polite nod, the kind of forgettable gesture that defined his entire presence on Flight 447. She moved on without a second glance. Marcus took a sip and returned his attention to the laptop balanced on his tray table, where a spreadsheet about quarterly sales projections glowed with mundane predictability. He looked exactly like what he appeared to be, a mid-level corporate employee in his early 40s, dressed in khakis and a button-down shirt, wearing wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an accountant's earnest anonymity. Nothing about him suggested anything remarkable. The teenage girl in the window seat beside him had her earbuds in, lost in her music. The elderly woman across the aisle had smiled at him during boarding with a grandmotherly expression that categorized him as nice young man, probably works in an office. This was exactly how Marcus Webb had lived for the past 6 years, deliberately, carefully, completely invisible. No one on this flight knew that the hands typing sales figures into Excel had once controlled a $70 million fighter jet through combat maneuvers at Mach 1.8. No one knew that Marcus Webb, sales manager, had once been Captain Marcus Ghost Rider Webb, one of the most decorated F-22 Raptor pilots in the United States Air Force. He preferred it that way. When he'd left active duty 6 years ago, he'd done it quietly. No fanfare, no retirement ceremony. His service record was classified. His combat decorations were in a box in his mother's attic. His call sign, Ghost Rider, was known only to the pilots who'd flown with him and the enemy combatants who'd learned to fear his tactical genius. He'd left the Air Force because his wife had asked him to. After 15 years of deployments and wondering if he'd come home, she'd simply said, "I can't do this anymore, Marcus. I need you here. Really here." Because he'd loved her more than flying, he'd said yes and walked away from the sky. But you don't stop being a fighter pilot just because you stop flying fighters. Even now, pretending to care about sales projections, some autonomous part of his brain was monitoring the aircraft's sounds, the subtle shifts in engine tone, the variations in vibration that passengers never noticed but which pilots felt in their bones. They were somewhere over the Rockies, the mountains reduced to wrinkled brown abstractions far below. 3 more hours to Denver, then the hotel, then 2 days of presentations that paid for his daughter's college fund. This was his life now, and he'd made peace with it. Mostly. The sound changed so subtly that most passengers didn't notice. But Marcus heard it immediately, a slight fluctuation in the engine tone that meant something had changed in the combustion process. His body responded before his conscious mind could analyze it, adrenaline flooding his system. He sat up straighter, listening. The cabin noise continued normally, but underneath, the engines had changed. Something was wrong. Then the left engine coughed. It was brief, barely noticeable. Passengers glanced up briefly, noted nothing seemed wrong, and returned to their activities. But Marcus was already running calculations. 10 seconds later, the right engine coughed. Same pattern. Same suggestion of something fundamentally wrong. The captain's voice came over the intercom with controlled professionalism. "Folks, this is Captain Richardson. We're experiencing a minor technical issue with our engines, and as a precaution, we're descending to a lower altitude. Please fasten your seatbelts." Minor technical issue. Marcus's jaw tightened. This wasn't minor. The aircraft began descending. But the engines kept coughing, each interruption more pronounced than the last. Then both engines stopped simultaneously. The constant background roar disappeared completely, replaced by an eerie whistling silence. The aircraft became a glider at 35,000 feet. Every passenger felt it, that gut-wrenching absence of sound that meant catastrophe. The teenage girl grabbed Marcus's arm. "What's happening? Why are the engines stopped?" Throughout the cabin, panic spread. Parents grabbed children. Couples clutched hands. Marcus heard the engines attempting restart, the distinctive whine of compressed air trying to initiate combustion. It was the right procedure. But the engines weren't responding. Captain Richardson's voice returned, stressed but controlled. "Folks, we've experienced engine failure and we're working to restart them. Please remain calm. We're in contact with air traffic control." The woman across the aisle was crying. Throughout the cabin, terror was amplifying through hundreds of people who suddenly understood they might die. Marcus's body flooded with adrenaline, but it wasn't panic. It was the crystal-clear focus of combat, the state where time slowed and every detail became hyper-acute. He'd been in worse situations. Had flown missions where enemy missiles tracked him, where his aircraft took damage. This was bad, but he'd trained for this exact scenario. The difference was he wasn't in the cockpit. Someone else was flying, and commercial aviation didn't prepare you for this kind of catastrophic emergency. Commercial pilots trained for single-engine failures, not compound catastrophes where both engines quit simultaneously at high altitude. But Marcus had those skills. He'd trained for exactly these scenarios because military aviation operated at the edge of aircraft performance. He knew procedures commercial pilots had never learned, techniques for coaxing power from systems that appeared dead. The question was whether revealing that knowledge was worth destroying 6 years of anonymity. Whether saving these people was worth becoming the fighter pilot again instead of Marcus Webb, sales manager. The answer came immediately: he couldn't sit here and let these people die when he might save them. Marcus unbuckled and stood up. The teenager grabbed his arm. "Where are you going?" "They said stay seated." "I need to talk to the pilots," Marcus said calmly. "Trust me." He moved forward with purposeful determination, maintaining balance as the aircraft descended. Passengers stared with confused terror. A flight attendant intercepted him. "Sir, you need to return to your seat immediately. I need to speak to the captain. I have information that might help." "Sir, that's not possible. Please return." Marcus lowered his voice with calm authority. "I'm a former Air Force fighter pilot with extensive experience in high-altitude engine failures. Captain Richardson is running through commercial protocols and they're not working. I might know approaches he hasn't tried." The flight attendant's eyes widened. She grabbed the intercom. "Captain Richardson, we have a passenger who claims to be a former military pilot with relevant experience." There was a pause. Then Captain Richardson's voice: "Send him forward." Marcus moved quickly. Every second mattered. They were probably at 28,000 feet, with maybe 12 minutes before they'd have to attempt an emergency landing on whatever terrain was below. The cockpit door opened. Captain Richardson was in the left seat, hands moving through restart procedures despite visible stress. The first officer was on radio with air traffic control. Every screen showed warning indicators: red lights, failure messages, comprehensive disaster. Richardson glanced back. "You're the military pilot?" "Captain Marcus Webb, United States Air Force, retired. F-22 Raptor pilot, 20 years active service." Marcus kept his voice professional. "What's your status?" "Both engines failed at 35,000. Attempted restart 17 times. No response. We're gliding with approximately 8 minutes before emergency landing." Marcus scanned the instrumentation with eyes trained to interpret these displays. Fuel quantities showed adequate supply, not fuel starvation. Exhaust temperatures showed residual heat but no combustion. Everything pointed to combustion failure, which was good news because combustion failures could potentially be overcome. Did you experience unusual sounds before failure? Brief coughing on both engines, 10 seconds apart, then simultaneous failure. Marcus processed this instantly. Fuel contamination. Probably water in the fuel that passed filtration. Commercial restart procedures won't work until you purge the system. The first officer looked back sharply. Purging fuel systems in flight isn't standard procedure. Correct. But it's a procedure I've performed multiple times in military aircraft. Marcus moved to the console. What do you need from me? Richardson asked. Access to fuel management and your emergency checklist. And trust that I know what I'm doing even when it looks wrong. Over the radio, air traffic control crackled. United 447, be advised we're scrambling F-35s from Buckley Air Force Base for escort. They'll be with you in 3 minutes. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. F-35s meant current generation fighters, pilots who might have heard stories but wouldn't recognize a retired pilot. Copy that, Richardson replied. United 447 has dual engine failure, attempting restart with assistance from passenger with military aviation experience. Brief pause from air traffic control. Copy. The F-35 flight lead is Raptor 1. They're requesting details about your consultant's background. Marcus leaned toward the radio with command voice that came automatically. Raptor 1, this is Captain Marcus Webb, United States Air Force retired, 20 years F-22 Raptor pilot, currently aboard United 447 as passenger, assisting with emergency procedures. The response came immediately, with sudden intense interest. United 447, Raptor 1. Captain Webb, can you confirm your call sign from active service? Marcus closed his eyes briefly. This was the moment. His anonymity ended here. But false modesty wasn't worth these people's lives. Ghost Rider, Marcus said quietly. My call sign was Ghost Rider. The radio exploded. Ghost Rider? Sir, this is Captain Jake Mitchell, Raptor 1 Actual. You trained half our squadron at Nellis. Sir, we're 30 seconds out, moving to escort formation. It's an honor to fly with you again. In the cockpit, Richardson's eyes went wide. The first officer turned completely around. Ghost Rider? The one with the classified combat record? The pilot they still use in tactical training? Marcus felt heat in his face. That was a long time ago. Right now we need to restart these engines. Captain Richardson, execute the following procedures exactly as I described them. Richardson looked at him differently now. Sir, would you prefer to take the controls? Negative. You're rated on this aircraft, I'm not. I'll guide you through procedures but you execute them. First, we're deliberately dumping fuel from the contaminated system while maintaining minimum flow through backup fuel lines. This seems counterintuitive at emergency fuel status, but we need to purge contaminated fuel and replace it with clean fuel from reserve tanks. Richardson's hands hesitated. If we dump fuel, we lose range. We might not make any airport. If we don't purge contaminated fuel, engines won't restart regardless of attempts, Marcus countered. Trust me. I've done this before. Through the windscreen, 2 F-35s moved into formation on either wing, close enough that Marcus could see the pilots' helmets. They maintained perfect formation, protective and ceremonial, a fighter pilot's honor guard. Captain Mitchell's voice came again. Air traffic control, Raptor 1. Be advised that Ghost Rider is one of the most decorated combat pilots in modern Air Force history. 43 combat missions, 17 aerial victories, 3 distinguished flying crosses. If anyone can bring that aircraft home safely, it's him. The first officer stared at Marcus with awe. Throughout the cabin, passengers hearing the radio communications reacted with confused hope. They didn't understand the technical details, but they understood that fighter jet speaking someone's name with reverence meant something important. Marcus shut out the attention. None of that mattered now. 247 people depended on his knowledge. Captain Richardson, initiate fuel dump from main tanks, both engines. Emergency dump procedure, maximum flow. Richardson hesitated one moment, then committed. His hands moved over the fuel management panel, executing commands that violated every commercial pilot instinct. But he trusted the man behind him, trusted the recognition in those F-35 pilots' voices. Fuel began streaming from dump valves, visible as fine mist. They were at 23,000 feet. The mountains were growing uncomfortably distinct. While contaminated fuel dumps, we prepare for modified restart sequence, Marcus continued steadily. This procedure uses the auxiliary power unit to preheat combustion chambers while forcing fuel flow through the backup system. It's a combat technique for engine failures from extreme maneuvers or damage. Commercial aviation doesn't use it because it stresses engines beyond normal parameters, but normal parameters aren't relevant when the alternative is crashing. Understood, Richardson said, gaining confidence from Marcus's certainty. What's the procedure? Marcus walked him through it step by step, adjusting fuel mixture controls, using the APU to generate compressed air for preheating combustion chambers, timing the restart sequence precisely when contaminated fuel had purged but before fuel quantities dropped critical. Complex, demanding, requiring coordination between systems not designed for this configuration. But possible. He'd done it before. The F-35s maintained formation silently, their presence a constant reminder that Marcus's identity was revealed. On civilian frequency, air traffic control coordinated emergency response, fire trucks positioning at the airport they might not reach, clearing airspace, notifying emergency services. Fuel dump complete, the first officer announced. Main tanks purged, operating on reserves. We've got maybe 20 minutes flight time if engines restart. They'll restart, Marcus said with quiet certainty. Captain Richardson, begin modified restart sequence. APU to maximum output, routing compressed air to both engines. Set fuel mixture to maximum rich to compensate for cold combustion chambers. Richardson's hands moved through the sequence, commercial training warring with unconventional procedures but desperation overriding hesitation. The APU wound to maximum, compressed air screaming through the restart system with intensity that vibrated the cockpit. Fuel mixture controls moved to positions they were never intended to occupy. Stand by for ignition sequence, Marcus said. His internal clock tracked everything: fuel flow, combustion temperature, system stress, descent rate, remaining altitude. They were at 19,000 feet. Mountains were very close. If this didn't work, they had maybe 4 minutes before attempting emergency landing on hostile terrain. 3, 2, 1, ignition. The left engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life violently, shaking the entire aircraft. Warning indicators flashed as the engine surged past normal startup parameters, running rough for seconds before fuel mixture stabilized and steady combustion filled the cockpit with beautiful sound. 5 seconds later, the right engine followed, equally violent and equally successful. Both engines running, generating thrust, pulling them from descent that threatened catastrophe. Throughout the cabin, passengers who'd been praying felt the change immediately. The silence was gone. The comforting roar returned. They weren't falling. They weren't going to die. Spontaneous cheering erupted, people crying with relief, strangers hugging, the teenage girl in 17C sobbing while the elderly woman thanked every deity imaginable. In the cockpit, Richardson's hands shook as he adjusted thrust controls. They're running clean. All indicators normal. Jesus Christ, you did it. Marcus felt his own hands shaking, adrenaline finally catching up. You did it, Captain. I just suggested the procedure. You executed perfectly. Sir, with respect, I would never have conceived that procedure in 1,000 years, Richardson said thickly. You just saved 247 lives using techniques I didn't know existed. Over radio, Mitchell's voice was jubilant. United 447, Raptor 1. Confirming visual on both engines running, exhaust normal, flight profile stabilized. Sir, that was the most beautiful flying I've ever witnessed. Welcome back, Ghost Rider. The F-35s performed a slow victory roll, a gesture military pilots reserved for special occasions, their sleek profiles twisting through sky in perfect synchronization before returning to escort. Through the window, Marcus could see the pilots saluting. Marcus nodded acknowledgement. His throat was tight with emotions he couldn't name: pride, embarrassment, relief, grief for lost anonymity, and something else. Something that felt like coming home, like rediscovering a part of himself he'd buried but which had never really left. Richardson extended his hand. Captain Webb, thank you doesn't begin to cover it. You just performed a miracle. Marcus shook his hand. Commercial aviation doesn't prepare pilots for catastrophic failures that military aviation considers routine possibilities. You did everything your training taught you. It just wasn't enough for this specific problem. No shame in that. Still, Richardson said quietly. 247 people go home to their families tonight because you happened to be on this flight. Because you were willing to reveal your background and help. That means something. The first officer coordinated with air traffic control, receiving vectors to the nearest major airport now that they had engine power. They'd land normally, or as normally as possible. Emergency vehicles would stand by, but they'd taxi to the gate under their own power. As the crisis receded, Marcus became aware of the attention focused on him. The flight attendant stared with amazement. Through the open cockpit door, passengers craned to see who'd been in the cockpit, whose name the F-35 pilots had spoken with reverence. He wanted to retreat to his seat, back to being Marcus Webb, sales manager, who nobody noticed. But he knew that version of himself was gone forever. The moment he'd said, Ghost Rider, the moment those pilots confirmed his reputation, the moment Richardson shook his hand with tears in his eyes, all of that permanently destroyed the invisibility he'd spent 6 years constructing. The teenage girl appeared in the cockpit doorway, crying but smiling. Are you really a fighter pilot? Did you really save us? Marcus felt his walls crumbling. I used to be a fighter pilot. Long time ago. And Captain Richardson saved you. I just helped. The fighter jets outside are saluting you, she said with wonder. Who are you? Before Marcus could deflect, Mitchell's voice came over radio connected to cabin PA, Ladies and gentlemen of United 447, this is Captain Jake Mitchell of the United States Air Force. On behalf of Raptor Flight and every pilot who's learned from Captain Marcus, Ghost Rider, Webb, we want you to know you were saved today by one of the greatest combat pilots in modern military history. Captain Webb is a legend in aviation circles, a warrior who's flown missions most of us can only imagine, a man whose tactical genius has saved countless lives throughout his career. You are the latest people to owe your lives to Ghost Rider, and we consider it a privilege to escort him home. The entire cabin erupted in applause. Marcus could hear it through the door, hundreds of people clapping, cheering, crying with gratitude, directing all that emotion toward the ordinary-looking man who'd been sitting quietly in 17C reading a magazine 30 minutes earlier. Richardson smiled despite exhaustion. Looks like your secret's out, Captain. Marcus managed a rueful smile. Looks like it. For what it's worth, Richardson said quietly, thank you for being willing to come out of retirement. Thank you for caring enough about strangers to risk whatever anonymity you'd built. That takes courage of a different kind. Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Because Richardson was right, walking away from the cockpit 6 years ago required courage. Staying away required discipline. But walking back into it, revealing who he really was, accepting that Ghost Rider couldn't stay hidden when people needed him, that required different strength entirely. The F-35s maintained escort throughout descent and landing approach, their presence visible testament to his identity now revealed to everyone aboard. Flight attendants who'd served him coffee watched in shock as fighter jets saluted this ordinary passenger. Fellow passengers gradually understood that the man they'd never noticed, who sat quietly reading a magazine, was actually a legendary fighter pilot whose invisibility came from choice, from deliberately keeping his military background private, and that his hidden identity contained the exact expertise needed to save them all. Air traffic control tracked the impossible recovery with amazement, monitoring an aircraft that should have crashed successfully, restoring power through procedures that proved sometimes the most qualified experts travel completely unnoticed, that extraordinary capability hides behind ordinary civilian appearances, that sometimes the person sitting next to you possesses skills that could save your life, and a reputation that makes active-duty fighter pilots speak his name with reverence. United 447 touched down smoothly at Denver International, Richardson's landing gentle despite the stress. Emergency vehicles lined the taxiways, their crews standing at attention rather than rushing forward, a gesture of respect from first responders who understood they'd witnessed something extraordinary. Firefighters saluted as they passed. Paramedics applauded. At the gate, Marcus tried to deplane quietly, tried to slip through unnoticed. But it was impossible. Passengers surrounded him, taking photos, asking for autographs, telling him about children who'd be alive because of him, about anniversaries they'd celebrate, about futures that existed because he'd been willing to reveal his background. Richardson walked with him through the terminal, running interference. "Is it always like this for you?" "No," Marcus said honestly. "I've spent 6 years making sure it's never like this. I left active duty specifically to avoid attention." "Why?" Richardson asked. "With your record, you could have commanded squadrons, probably made general. Why walk away?" Marcus thought about his wife's face the night she'd asked him to leave the Air Force. About his daughter's face when he'd been home for her birthday for the first time in years. About choosing family over flying, being present over being exceptional. "Because my wife asked me to," he said simply. "Because my daughter needed a father who was actually there. Because I'd spent 20 years being Ghost Rider and I wanted to find out who Marcus Webb could be when he wasn't always in a cockpit." Richardson nodded slowly. "And today? Do you regret revealing your background?" Marcus thought about the teenage girl's tears, the elderly woman's blessing, about 247 people alive because he'd used knowledge he'd spent 6 years pretending he didn't have. He thought about the feeling in the cockpit when engines restarted, about solving impossible problems with precision, about the fundamental satisfaction of doing something he was genuinely exceptional at. "Ask me in a few days," he said with a slight smile. "Right now I'm still processing." His phone vibrated, probably his wife calling after seeing news reports, probably terrified, probably about to learn her husband's carefully maintained civilian identity had been permanently compromised. He'd need to explain about the engines failing, about F-35 pilots recognizing his call sign, about becoming Ghost Rider again in front of 300 witnesses. But he found he was okay with that. He'd spent 6 years being invisible because he'd thought that's what his family needed, what he needed to build civilian life. But today proved invisibility wasn't the same as presence, that hiding his identity wasn't the same as being home, that Ghost Rider and Marcus Webb were both essential parts of who he was rather than incompatible alternatives. A news crew spotted him, asking for comment about the emergency. Marcus straightened his shoulders, faced them directly, and spoke with calm confidence that had defined his command presence for 20 years. "I'm grateful I was able to help Captain Richardson and his crew save the lives of everyone aboard Flight 447. Commercial aviation is incredibly safe, but when rare emergencies occur, having diverse expertise can make a critical difference. I encourage everyone to continue trusting commercial aviation while also appreciating the skill of pilots like Captain Richardson who handle impossible situations with professionalism and courage." The reporter pressed for details about his military background. Marcus answered some questions, deflected others due to classification, maintaining balance between public accountability and operational security. He was professional, articulate, present, not hiding, but not boasting. Just being honest about who he was. He boarded his flight home with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in 6 years. Not because he'd returned to being a fighter pilot, but because he'd finally accepted he'd never stopped being one. The skills, the mindset, the readiness to respond when expertise was needed, those weren't things you could retire from. They were fundamental parts of identity that remained regardless of job title or clothing or deliberate anonymity. As the aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude, Marcus looked out at the sky that had been his home for 20 years, then returned his attention to the laptop where his sales projections still glowed with mundane predictability. Both were real. Both mattered. Both were part of who he was. Ghost Rider had returned. Not because Marcus Webb had disappeared, but because they'd finally learned to coexist. The fighter pilot who'd saved 247 lives wasn't separate from the sales manager who coached Little League. They were the same person, viewed from different angles, and both versions deserved acknowledgement rather than denial. Marcus smiled slightly and returned to his spreadsheet. Tomorrow he'd attend his sales conference. Next week he'd coach his daughter's soccer game. And if another emergency ever required the skills only Ghost Rider possessed, he'd be ready, not as a resurrection of his past, but as integration of his present. Nobody had known he was a fighter pilot. Now everybody knew. And that, Marcus finally understood, was exactly as it should be.